Good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate the introduction. Um, Everybody knows, of course, that Hugo Chavez died last week. I think it was April 5th or 4th, and even that's a matter for debate. Um, but in this post-Chavez era, there is a struggle underway right now on whether a regime that is really a narco state and the best friend of Hezbollah and Iran in this hemisphere might be replaced by a friendly democratic neighbor, the likes of which Venezuela was before Hugo Chavez. It's likely that in these April 14th elections, the Chavista regime will hold on to power, in my view. But that succession is not stable in the short run and not sustainable in the long run, and I'll talk about why. But a lot of this has to do with the fundamentals being shaken, the foundations being shaken in Venezuela under that ruling Chavista regime. There's an impending socioeconomic meltdown, rampant street crime, the faltering oil sector, bitter infighting within the Chavista movement, complicity with drug trafficking and terrorism that really casts a serious doubt on the legitimacy of any such regime, and the inept performance of Nicolas Maduro, the designated successor, as well as a growing rejection of Cuba's really heavy-handed role in the succession and the corrupt institutions and rigged electoral process that will help the Chavistas hold on to power. Beset by all of these challenges, I think, and with Chavez no longer at the top of the ballot, they're going to have to pull out all the stops to hold on to power and engineer a victory on April 14th, which I expect they will. A little bit about these economic challenges in greater detail. There was a currency evaluation in February, which was really too little too late to break the fall of the Venezuelan economy that has been decimated for 14 years by gross mismanagement, staggering corruption, and policies that were really consciously meant to strangle the private sector. The Chavista economic team is scrambling now to stabilize that economy in advance of the April 14th elections, but their incompetence, really their ideological disorientation, is evident as they ratchet up restrictions that will stifle production and commerce. I had thought maybe that they would adopt in a post-Chavez period some sort of tactical moderation, both politically and economically, but that does not seem to be the case. There does not seem to be any sort of subtle pivoting in either the economic policies or political trajectory or the rhetoric of the regime. You see inflation, food shortages, power outages, a crumbling infrastructure, which is taking a terrible toll more and more on all Venezuelans across the board. And we suspect that this devaluation will hit the working class, the lower class, more impoverished sector of that economy just about the time these elections are taking place. There will be no windfall of oil revenues because production is greatly diminished and really oversubscribed. Actual production of Venezuela of oil, contrary to what their official numbers is, about 2.4 million barrels a day. That's far below the peak of 3.3 million barrels a day before Chavez. And sweetheart deals with China and Russia and Iran and giveaways to Cuba and the other client states in the Caribbean and Central America are bleeding Venezuela dry. There simply is no more oil to sell at this point. There will also be no China bailout. And what do I mean by that? In the 18 months leading up to the elections where Chavez won a term which he never actually began, the Chinese loaned about $28 billion to Chavez, which was used in campaign election year spending right before those elections. But Beijing has closed the checkbook. A couple of months ago, they summoned Elias Hawa, who was one of Chavez's inner circle people, to Beijing. He thought he could cajole them into giving them more money leading into this election, and they said, no, I'm afraid not, because there's no production, and they had serious doubts about the legitimacy of the regime and whether they would ever be paid back by a successor government. Frankly, Chavez came into office politicizing PDVSA, the state-run petroleum company, and he used its revenue as his petty cash fund. And now the company is ruined, and the till is run dry. It's filled with IOUs. Talk a little bit about the political infighting that's shaking the base of Chavismo. Reflect on the fact that, as I describe this, that reflect on the state of Chavismo, that we're talking about infighting that pits a wing that's loyal to Havana, a failed government of Cuba, hardly a legitimate one, against a wing that is loyal to the narco military. So the failed foreign ideological hard left loyal to Havana, and those who see government as an opportunity to make more money and be complicit in drug trafficking. Maduro, as I mentioned, the acting president, de facto president, and Elias Howe, who's now foreign minister, are those who sort of carry the Cuban flag in this whole process, and the Cubans seem to be winning. And we see sort of overdone rhetoric and radicalization being employed by Maduro now that really has Cuba's fingerprints all over it. Very anti-American, very rabid, very radical. Diosdado Cabello is the president of the National Assembly. He sort of leads the other wing. He's mostly interested in maintaining the impunity that is required to be a narco state. And he has doubts whether Maduro can hold on to power in the long run, and he doesn't want to put his life and his fortune, tens of billions of dollars, in the hands of these ideologues managed from Cuba. And there is a measure of nationalism mixed in here within the Venezuelan military that rejects this interference of the Cubans. So far, Cabello seems to be closing ranks with Maduro. He could have challenged Maduro's legitimacy under Article 233 of the Venezuelan Constitution. He has, as president of the National Assembly, should have assumed the presidency. But Maduro moved more quickly and brazenly, and he claimed that job. Cabello has gone along with that in the short run. He's closed ranks for now. But if the election begins to look shaky, it is a possibility that the military, which has a big role in running those elections, may decide that it doesn't want to steal that election for Havana's people and for people that they have doubts about. And on these elections, certainly Chavismo has a distinct institutional advantage. They have, of course, some residue of popularity because Chavez was a popular figure to a considerable extent, particularly among the very poor. And they have this great institutional unfair advantage and access to the media. Virtually most of the independent media silenced the president with access to the so-called cadenas, where he can insist that every network in the country carry his speeches, which could go on for long periods of time. And the opposition, which has much fewer resources to buy the kind of advertising and access to the media that they would need to get their message out. The question is, will the state have the resources to motivate and mobilize the voters? To motivate them, that is to say, with giveaway programs, a lot of cash on the street, and mobilizing, literally getting them to the polls. They have a very sophisticated mechanism that few people know about. That when you enter a voting place, you put your thumbprint down. That thumbprint registers your name, and the Chavista electoral command knows immediately that you voted. So consequently, around midday, they know who has not voted, and they have the cell numbers and the addresses of everybody that has not voted, whose vote they count on, and they literally go down and pick them up one at a time. So you have satellite imagery of every street, and they have the routes of the trucks and buses will drive to get their vote out. Now that's, frankly, the DNC and the RNC would love to have that system, but only one side has that system in Venezuela today. And that's not fair. So as long as that continues, they're probably that's their important advantage. But there are disadvantages too. First, Maduro is not Chavez, and Maduro is Maduro. That's another disadvantage. He's not Chavez. If you can Google roguish charm, and you'll find hits for roguish charm. And Chavez is a charming rogue. Maduro's not. He may be a rogue, but he's not particularly charming. So there's the charisma deficit. Chavez was able to modulate because he was a strong figure in his own right. Maduro's not. He seems to be following this Cuban script, which is very radical, very polarizing, very shrill. It comes off, nevertheless, as a clumsy, pale imitation of Chavez. And then also these unpopular economic policies are going to begin to bite, and they won't have the resources to mobilize their voters. Capriles, on the other hand, he's being much more aggressive than he was against Chavez because, again, Maduro is not Chavez. He also has nothing to lose. He has invigorated his base with this tougher rhetoric, and also those neither this person nor that person, who have sat out, that's roughly 2.5 million voters who've sat out every election in the last decade, may see this as their last chance. And they may be even further mobilized or motivated by Maduro's shrill rhetoric. Also, I can assure you, none of these people have been sitting around for 10 years waiting for an opportunity to vote for Nicolas Maduro. And they never came out to vote for Chavez or his opponent, but it's very likely that they won't come out. Those that do come out now will be Capriles or opposition voters. So if there's an obvious fraud to hold on to power, that will delegitimize that regime, if there's somebody around to talk about it. But the United States' official position in this election, and remember how I described it, between the possibility of electing a government that would lead back to the friendly, positive, constructive relationships of a prosperous country with the United States, or an enemy of the United States, the best friend of Iran and Hezbollah and narco-terrorists. The official position of the United States State Department is neutrality. Neutrality, which suggests that they're either insulting our intelligence or revealing their own lack of it. What should be on the table with the successor regime? Democracy and human rights. Obviously, the State Department does not care about that, and neither will a Chavista successor, of course. But drugs, the fact that you have a narco state in Venezuela today, and will, if Chavez's designated successor wins the election. And what do I mean by that? Diosdado Cabello, the president of the National Assembly, the former head of the Army, the former Minister of Defense, the current Vice Minister of the Interior, all implicated in narco trafficking. In the last 7 years, acquiring tens of billions of dollars from that trade, which they don't want to give up. We need to have that on the table. Also, the fact that today Venezuela is one of Iran's best friends in the world, serving as a way to cut around international sanctions and providing safe haven to Hezbollah in their territory, and really a partnership with Hezbollah. And I'll stop on this, I think, dramatic note. The number 2 person of the Venezuelan embassy in Damascus today is a man named Ghassia Tefnes Ardin Abu Ali. Venezuelan. It's not a very common Venezuelan last name. Well, there's a reason for that. He was born in Lebanon. And he's essentially Hezbollah's envoy to the Venezuelan government. And he's like this with Nicolas Maduro, the new president of Venezuela. He is on the U.S. Treasury's list of persons providing logistical and material support to Hezbollah. And that's the kind of regime that we're talking about. Those are the stakes that are at play today in Venezuela. Thank you.